Okay, guys, you won't believe it. I just made a Sumco account yesterday, and let me just give you a list of the services that I have signed up to provide as an expert on Sumco. Okay, now I can provide flamenco dance lessons. I can provide LED flower lessons, modeling lessons, kalimba lessons. I don't even know what a kalimba is. Apparently, it's an instrument. And string art lessons.
Oh
Funny.
my God.
Yes, and there are
Wow.
so
I want some
more.
flowers.
LED flowers to just decorate your whole room. It's great that I can sign up for like all of this, but I just thought it was hilarious. The lack of regulation around this. Isn't this a bit concerning?
You're totally right on that. And it's like Sumco isn't the only platform that has that kind of problem. While it has a lot of positive benefits to providing these services, the rapid development of sharing economies like Sumco is probably resulting in unintended shortcomings for three different stakeholders: consumers, providers, and platforms.
And with that introduction, let's get into this week's topic, which is sharing economies. Hello, everyone. We are back with another episode of Digital Dwellers, a podcast where
Lucy, Rachel,
and I do a deep dive into all the interesting and sus digital developments we encounter in our daily lives. And as stated before, today we are talking about sharing economies. But before we dive in, Lucy, could you define sharing economies for our listeners?
Sure. Basically, a sharing economy is where assets owned by members of a network can be temporarily accessed by other members of the network, generally through an online platform. Think Uber, Kakao, Sumgo, Airbnb, things like that. To add to this, we can use this definition to designate three key players in sharing economies: providers, platforms, and consumers.
Now, based on my understanding, sharing economies have become a trend highly associated with digitalization, correct?
Right, the concepts go directly hand in hand. One great benefit of this is that processes that were once difficult are a lot easier now.
But of course, this has to come with repercussions, doesn't it?
Yeah, like we saw before, Sumco has its downfalls. So just because people are signing up for it doesn't mean they'll always be qualified or dedicated to the service they are providing.
Yeah, sustainability is a huge issue that many sharing economies are facing right now. Let's take Uber for example. Uber is struggling with low driver retention. According to a study that analyzed data from 2013, after 6 months, 30% of drivers from Uber have become inactive, seemingly due to unfair compensation.
I feel like I've heard about Uber's unfair compensation before, just as a general complaint. It must be difficult to balance consumer satisfaction with provider satisfaction.
It really is difficult to balance. In fact, it seems as if balancing is almost impossible to reach, and one side is almost always negatively affected. Like keeping on Uber, for example, I'll use their surge pricing to demonstrate this. I read a 2020 study on the effects of Uber's surge pricing that had one key takeaway, quote, "Without surge pricing, supply can be a total failure for matching demand," end quote.
So in order to keep providers, it's the platform having no choice but to hurt consumers and vice versa. There's also the issue of harm to traditional providers of the service as well. Take Tada, for example. When it was first introduced, it quickly gained popularity, but then due to backlash from the taxi union, it ended up just being banned.
What do you mean by banned?
So the service operated by providing vans to drivers to rent, and then a mobile app that connected the drivers and cars to passengers. The Taxi Drivers Union ended up claiming that the service violated Korea's Passenger Transportation Act, and there was a long legal battle that eventually ended up in a Supreme Court ruling that the service was not operating illegally, but it still led to the service initially being shut down. And while they do still operate transportation-related services, the original Tada Basic is unlikely to come back. The National Assembly ended up passing a bill that amended the Passenger Transport Service Act, specifically prohibiting rental of 11-seater vehicles for any use other than tourism and a few other specifications. And these were specifically the type of vehicles that Tata provided. So even though it ended up technically not being illegal, they had been operating under a loophole in the original law that was then eventually banned.
Seems like the idea of a loophole or exception is kind of a theme with these types of digital platforms.
Right? So the technology changes so fast, but legal systems also are kind of slow and they don't always end up matching.
Johan, I feel like you've told us something about that before.
Yes, I can't share exactly, but I did work for this edutech startup, and we set out to create a sharing economy where parents would sign their kids up to learn English from Ivy League tutors who lived abroad. It was only after our official release, when we made this into a paid service, that we realized that there were some legal issues that prevented undergraduates or people without teaching degrees who lived abroad from teaching minors in Korea.
That makes a lot of sense. So, like, as a foreigner, there's very specific requirements to get a visa allowing you to teach English. You have to have a bachelor's degree, submit a background check, and also only people from 7 specific English-speaking countries are eligible.
What? So was the service banned?
Naturally, that's what I thought, but a few days later, I learned that we had hired a legal team to basically change the law for us. And surprisingly, this is not big news. A lot of tech startups are partnering with legal teams in order to address untimely laws that disregard digitalization and primarily take conventional forms of transactions into account.
Well, I think that's interesting, but it is important to note the effects of sharing platforms not only apply on a global scale, but also on a local scale.
Within communities, right?
Yeah, exactly. I found a really interesting study from 2023 that collected data from local restaurants in Austin, Texas, USA. The study found that once ride-sharing companies entered into the local economy, customer satisfaction with service quality at local restaurants actually decreased.
Really? Like, what was the reason for that?
Well, according to the study, it's a matter of resources, and the resource being people. Being a driver for a ride-sharing app can be a relatively easy way to make money, as you know, so low-wage and low-skill workers just switch to those jobs instead of staying at their previous labor-intensive jobs.
Could you say that sharing economies harm the communities that they enter?
So yes, in some ways, but in other ways, they actually work to improve satisfaction. I've also read a 2015 study that had the effects of ride-sharing apps on local taxi services. It was conducted using research out of Chicago and New York and found that competition of rideshare apps saw a correlation with a decrease in complaints about taxi services. So according to the researchers, the presence of competition ended up forcing taxi drivers to improve their services in order to still receive business, overall increasing customer satisfaction.
So while sharing economies led to a more fanned out workforce, they can also lead to improved services among competing service providers.
Right. Sharing economies definitely seem to be disrupting communities, but whether you think that's a positive or negative depends on which angle you look at it.
And sharing economies are also just so new. Who knows how those effects can change in the future?
So based on our conversation, I couldn't help but realize how fast sharing economies are developing, despite the fact that many societies don't necessarily seem ready to integrate them into their social, economic, and maybe even political systems.
Right, that's a totally valid concern and obviously one that's shared by many. I mean, we see governments trying to regulate and compensate for the creative destruction that arises with the oncoming of sharing economies.
Yeah, I think it's balancing between the fine line of having too many regulations so as to prohibit innovation and liberty of companies, not having enough regulations to undermine startups' competitiveness in markets that are already dominated by big companies.
So then, how do we even regulate these companies?
Right now, I think many platforms are leaning towards co-regulation, where platform operators work together with participants of their sharing economy to regulate consumers and suppliers voluntarily and reduce transaction risks.
And although that sounds quite formidable, it could start with something as simple as a rating or review system. The rating system theoretically should commend those who provide high-quality services, while also pointing out shortcomings in the platform and suppliers within the platform.
Of course, such data could be very unrepresentative or biased, but it still indicates the companies are slowly realizing that they must take the initiative to regulate their sharing economies, and also that we, as participants in sharing economies, possess some responsibility to provide feedback to these services.
This was a great conversation, and once again, thank you so much for your helpful insight, you guys. It's always a blast talking to you. For our listeners, we hope you can leave today's episode with a bunch of new questions, curiosities, and concerns on your mind. Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast, and we hope to see you all next week as well. Goodbye.
Bye.